So I don't get too emotional, I decided I needed to write this first part down because it will be easier to read than to just speak off the top of my head or from my heart. So by way of introduction, I first spoke on this topic, and this is my second time speaking on the topic, I think. The first time I spoke on the topic of transgenderism, I was giving an oral report in grad school. I was working toward my master's degree in marriage, family, and child counseling at a Christian college. And my class had been given the assignment of writing a 30-page research paper on one of the disorders listed in the DSM-3. If you're not familiar with DSM-3, 4, 5, this is the diagnostic criteria, diagnostic and statistical manual put out by the American Psychiatric Association. When I was in grad school, it was the DSM-3. Now they are using the DSM-5, so this was a while back in my life. My topic was transsexualism, and when I announced it to my fellow students in the class, remember this is a Christian college, when I announced it to my fellow students, there were some snickers and some sideways glances, especially from the back of the room. I strengthened my resolve and proceeded to give my report, speaking about a person I had worked with having this disorder. I disguised his identity and tried to keep a professional demeanor, all the while aching in my heart for the struggles of this person whom I loved. You see, I had chosen this topic because I was struggling to understand what was happening to the man I had married 6 years prior, and how God could have allowed him to suffer the mental turmoil he'd experienced from a very young age. I had met Gary, and I've changed his name, in a Baptist church, serving alongside him in a music ministry performing group. We had so much in common. I loved being with him. We became best friends. He was from a Christian home, and his parents were both active in serving the Lord in the church. He was talented, funny, and anything but feminine. Our marriage was full of fun and socializing and church activities, but there was very little emotional or physical intimacy in our relationship. And although Gary was a Christian, he never seemed comfortable talking about spiritual things. After a couple of years, we tried to get pregnant and discovered after many infertility tests that we would never be able to conceive. And while I grieved, Gary began exhibiting some strange behaviors. I was alarmed and tried to get him to talk to me about his feelings and the reasons behind his changed demeanor. But he refused. Months went by, and I pressed him for answers. When he finally decided to tell me the truth, Gary put on a dress, makeup, and a wig, and waited for me to return home from work. When I walked in the house and saw him, he said, "I'd make a fine father, wouldn't I? I've always had these feminine feelings." I couldn't have been more shocked if I'd found him dead on the floor. Instead, I found myself on the floor. That horrifying night was the beginning of my journey into the painful reality of gender identity disorders. So, what is transsexualism? Let's talk about some of the terms that you've probably heard, and maybe some you haven't heard, on media, maybe in your circles of friends, or maybe somebody you even know that has a disorder. There was, going back to the 1700s, and I'm not going to get into details about this, but in the Romantic movement, the Romantic period, there were some philosophers who began talking about the self, And of course, you know, this goes back probably to the beginning of time, talking about the self, and but especially in the 1700s, beginning to look at the person as primarily feelings based, and beginning to define a person's identity more by feelings than by the whole person, our intellect, our spirituality, etc. And then quickly moving up to the 1950s, there began this ideological split of the whole person, looking at sex versus gender. And gender was a linguistic term. If you've studied any languages, you know some of them, like Spanish, for instance, have masculine and feminine words. Well, a man named John Money, he was a psychologist, borrowed this term, gender, and began to use it in a sense of being separate from sex. So while God created male and female, and we looked at that as the two sexes, in the 50s, this man began writing and speaking on this idea that gender was separate from sex. He was a very controversial figure, John Money. If you look him up, you're probably going to be appalled at the types of experiments he did with children. It's absolutely despicable. But going through the 60s and the sexual revolution, things just really began to rapidly change in our country, but really all over the world. So let's look at this split. We have biological sex, which really is about the physiology, the chromosomes, XX or XY. I always get these mixed up and have to really think about it in my head, but XX is what?
Female.
Belongs to female, and XY chromosomes, male, okay? But we have this new description of biological sex, and that is sex assigned at birth. Think about that. We'll talk about it more. And then we have the split of gender identity, and this can best be described by answering the question, how do you feel? Do you feel male or female? And if you start to think about that deeply, that's a very strange question, because how do we describe our feelings if we're not describing them in terms of male or female sex, right? But anyway, sex assigned at birth, and then gender identity. So this gender identity is how individuals see themselves internally, regardless of their biological sex. So gender dysphoria is the diagnostic term that would be used in the medical field and in the psychological field. And this is the experience of incongruence between one's biological sex and gender identity. This typically begins around the ages of 2 to 4. That blew my mind when I first heard that. But my ex-husband, Gary, had said that he began feeling those feelings and having that sense that he was a female inside a male body when he was 4 years old. The prevalence of gender dysphoria, it's very rare. You would think that it's a lot larger prevalence, considering how much is in the news media about it and the activism that's going on in the political realm. But the prevalence is actually, in males, 0.005%. to, no, that's females, sorry, 0.005 to 0.014% of the population. And then in females, 0.002 to 0.003%. Although this dysphoria is a psychological disorder, activists have convinced the mainstream and politicians that trans persons are just one manifestation of normal gender identities. Professionals who view gender dysphoria as a mental disorder describe it as a type of body dysmorphia, similar to anorexia. Okay, if you know anorexia nervosa, this is when typically females, but there can be males, starve themselves because they see themselves, they experience themselves as fat. And so this is a problem in the mind. This is a way that someone views themselves that is not in sync with reality. But to speak out at this point in our culture and say that it is a psychological disorder, we're going to face persecution if we come right out and say that. And so some of the uneasiness of my writing this book, being published, and speaking about it. So you can pray for me about that.
Well, and isn't it, so wouldn't people accept, like, there's a disorder in that there is a problem,
Mm-hmm.
and yet the solutions for the problem would be change the body versus change the mind.
Exactly. And, you know, when you weigh the two, and I've listened to many testimonials and done a lot of reading, when you weigh the two, the risks of changing the body are huge. Changing the mind is a very difficult thing. In fact, when I was in grad school studying about this, I was in the library looking at psychological journals and research, and there was basically nothing out there that showed that there was any hope for somebody with this disorder, that it persists through adulthood, and there was basically one story, one research project that had been written about a teenager who was too young to have any type of sex reassignment surgery, so-called, and so he had gone through some psychotherapy and it helped him, but he didn't feel totally cured. So what I'm speaking of right now, this gender dysphoria in adults, as I mentioned, begins early on in childhood. But when we look at childhood gender dysphoria, it's the same. This is the condition as I mentioned before, but it resolves itself as they go through puberty 80 to 90% of the time. Okay? So this has a lot that we can think about when it comes to
That's
children.
very indicative, isn't it?
Yes. And when we think about schools educating children as young as preschoolers about that they can be whatever they want to be. They don't have to be this gender binary. They can decide and determine how they want to live and experience their own bodies.
So why does it ignore that?
We'll get there.
Okay.
Okay. One question on So the numbers up there, the 0.005% to 0.014%, is that persistent into adulthood? Or is that the child and then 80% of those are going to?
No, these are statistics from the adult population,
Okay.
okay? So, you know,
The ones who it didn't resolve,
correct,
they're going up, okay.
correct.
So then is gender dysphoria a bigger percentage in 2 to 4? Is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yeah, that there would be more children who, like, you would.
Yeah, the tomboys, the boys playing with girls, possibly dressing up, just, you know, that whole thing and having confusion as they're growing up.
Okay.
Typically resolves itself in most children.
But to suggest to a child that hasn't reached puberty yet, to suggest that, hey, the choice of sex is in your mind. I mean, you can randomly make a choice. Why put that thought in that kid's mind when he hasn't got the physical characteristics yet? And
How many of you, when you were in kindergarten, even knew what sex was, even thought about these kinds of things, even if you were experiencing, you know, questions within yourself? We're not thinking like that. And yet scholastic books, I used to be a teacher, Scholastic Book Club, which I loved using with my students, and many teachers use that so they can buy books geared to their age. Scholastic Books now sells books on accepting the friend who changes their name from male to female, or you know, there's also a publication, several publications that have come out. One of them called the Genderbread Man, and it's a poster, and another one called the Gender Unicorn. And it's a cute Barney type character, and it's got some simple things along the side that a teacher in public school can use to talk to their children. And this is all in the name of acceptance, tolerance. We want to teach our children to love everyone, and we want them to be comfortable in their own skin.
You just got through saying that a child doesn't think about those things when they're 3 and 4 years old. So why are these adults putting that thought in their minds?
Why? Why do you think?
Yeah,
Indoctrination.
Confusion.
yeah, to confuse them, to, you know, your rights are being challenged, et cetera, but these are children, for crying out loud. So
Well,
they don't learn any different.
And they're for the ones that persist, that the disconnect between their mind and their bodies creates a great deal of anxiety, to the point that suicide rates are significant among this population. And so I mean, you're right, there is the indoctrination part, there is we're trying to change society's view. But I think there are some that it comes out of a place of, if this child grows up not feeling like people care, that they're ostracized, they're unclean, then we might set them on a path where they end up choosing suicide. And so to prevent that, we need to bend over way too far the other way to say, no, everything's okay. But then the question becomes, does that actually help? So they're in their minds, they're trying to save lives, right? but does it actually help? And in the long term, does it actually help the person to change the body versus changing the mind? Because if the problem's in the brain, in the mind, then no amount of physical reconstruction can really, I mean, you can't really turn a woman to a man or to a man to a woman. You can get to an approximation, but you still haven't really solved you know, the fact that they feel that there is a problem with their body. So
That's true.
But the next problem that follows, if we ever get to the place where they're fully accepted, then I deserve to be in any position I so desire, and I want to be a teacher, and I want to profess.
Anita, how far back are we talking that this started? You mentioned something about the 1700s. Was this a thing then that they just didn't talk about, or does this go all the way back to biblical days, or do you know, or is there any way to know?
I don't know how far it goes back. I imagine that this has been happening ever since sin entered the world. But people didn't talk about it. You know, in the 50s, a few people were talking about it. And, you know, with the sexual revolution in the 60s, you know, these topics were coming up in conversation.
I'm old enough to remember, I'm 82, I can remember back in the 50s. And guys that didn't seem like guys, were called sissies. That's all we knew about it. Usually you don't want to be a sissy. I can remember that. That you know, 10, 11.
Which is sad and unfortunate that, you know, but we know that's part of childhood, unfortunately. The whole idea of being bullied and all of that, that's not a new thing. It's been around forever.
And so part of me wonders, for some, and maybe these are the cases that resolve themselves, to realize, okay, we do have cultural expectations for men and for women. That, okay, girls play with Barbies and pink, and boys play with trucks and tractors, and they wear blue, you know. And that starts even from, you know, the newborn age. So I wonder how many are just like, I don't fit into society's, you know, like, I'm not let me go take my axe and chop down a tree and, you know, build something with my bare hands. Okay, but that doesn't mean you're not a man.
Yeah.
It means you're just not that type of man. That, you know, if you're studious or into the arts or other things, that is fine. You can be a man and be those things. And so I wonder if society, we add confusion because we say a little boy who is interested in fashion, you know, with his, like, that doesn't mean you think you're a girl. It just means you have an interest that's outside the norm, but it doesn't mean you're, you know, or a tomboy, a girl who likes to play sports. That doesn't mean you're not feminine. You know, you can be feminine and into sports. It's do we create that hard line where it doesn't need to be, which then bleeds over into the psychological angst that people feel?
That's a really good point. A really good question. And I think the best way to look at this is it's a very complex issue. To date, no one psychologist is willing to stand up and say, this is what it is, I completely understand it, and let me explain it to you. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done, and as Christians, a lot of humility and prayer and, looking to Jesus to know what our response should be,
When
When you're,
as Christian professionals, do they see it as a spiritual battle? It seems like that's what I'm talking about there.
Yes, I believe that, that is probably the case. Part of my finishing the last few chapters of my book is gonna be speaking with, some professionals, Christian professionals, and just getting their take on, is it spiritual, is it psychological, is it physical, what do you think?
It is complex. When you're talking about those with true gender dysphoria, it starts very early and it is persistent. The rise of the trans movement, a lot of that, I think, goes to Sam's point of, well, I'm a tomboy, so therefore I must be a boy, or I like to sing, therefore, or I like drama, therefore I must really be. And you're right in that we're gonna save these kids from suicide. It's being pushed by those with gender dysphoria who grew up struggling with that and still haven't really dealt with it. They may have had, surgery, but it's not based on science.
Well, and it's not only being pushed by a few who have gender dysphoria, it's largely being pushed by what the trans community calls allies, who have picked up this cause and are running with it. I want to keep moving because the most important thing we can do is get into the Bible.
Can I say one thing?
Sure.
But what you were just describing is the most stereotypical thing about gender and whatever, like where, well, we assume that you can't be these things, and that seems to be the argument that they're making, that they don't stereotype people into things, but yet that would be true. I mean, it's like self-contradictory in my mind, where you can't be. My daughter used to tease me, and she'd say things like, "Dad, it's bad enough you're a choir director. Don't go on, with this stuff." I mean, it's just a running thing with us. But the point being is, see, that's a stereotypical type of thing, and yet that's exactly what seems like the movement's doing. Is pigeonholing.
If I'm really a woman rather than a man,
I have to be.
then I have to be stereotypical woman.
Yeah, I could be a male nurse. I can't be,
Yeah.
a male secretary or whatever. Like, I mean, it just, to me, it's like, can't you see the hypocrisy of what you're doing?
Okay, so that leads me to the next word, the actual word transgender, or trans as most people call it now. This is actually an umbrella term for anyone. This is in today's conversations about gender identity. It's an umbrella term for anyone whose gender identity or expression differs from their biological sex. So here we're talking about the LGBTQ+, and the plus stands for dozens and dozens of created gender identities, such as pansexual, pangender, agender, non-binary, etc.
And to the point of that, the LGBTQ+, some of those are sexual orientations in terms of who they want to be intimate with, and some refer to gender expressions which is also adds confusion because then we lump it all together.
Yeah. And thanks for bringing that up because not everybody in that umbrella is totally comfortable with the other groups who are listed under that umbrella. Okay? All right, transsexual, now considered to be someone who has transitioned to living as the opposite sex with or without surgery or hormones. Now, what we've been talking about is the psychological disorder. There's a whole separate thing called a social contagion or a teen craze. This is an excellent book. If you're interested in learning more about that, Abigail Schreier has written a great book called Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. You know, you may have heard of whole groups of girls all deciding that they were going to be transgender, and all of them taking hormones and all of them taking on this identity. And these are children who did not have gender dysphoria when they were younger. This is a whole different thing. And we've seen teen crazes, you know, throughout history, but this one is so damaging because when a boy or a girl decides to take puberty blockers, and these are easily given at Planned Parenthood, even without a doctor's letter, they are at great risk for many physiological problems, for infertility. Girls who take male hormones will probably never regain their voice because it drops and becomes lower, and even if they change their minds later on, they've still got this deep voice. There are many other problems that you know, that can come along with, like hypertension, type 2 diabetes, breast cancer, cervical cancer, etc. So
Got a question.
they're not as innocent as we're being told. These puberty
And no
blockers.
long-term studies
hormones.
done on any of it.
Right. And so we're giving kids this stuff without any proof that it does good or does harm. So what you were gonna say?
Of course, you just identified the physical problems that could occur after they've made this choice to pursue the change. I got this question, psychologically, after they make the change, are they satisfied?
Sadly, well, I think we have to look at the teen group separately from the adult group because they're dealing with puberty. I mean, we all know how hard it was going through junior high, high school, trying to figure things out, not feeling totally comfortable, feeling like we needed to belong, and yet we didn't belong, and we're not cool. I mean, there's just a whole host of things that teens go through. We know this. We've experienced it, and you know, I feel for the ones who are experiencing it now. But for the adults who go through gender, as they call it, transition, sex reassignment surgery, there is still a high suicide rate. In fact, I'm going to get to that. Well,
You just said something that has disturbed me. You said these teenagers were together and they decided to go through it. It wasn't that they had the feeling, it was peer pressure thing.
Well, and it's also this confusion about, who am I? What's my place in this world? All the things that, we go through. But also, they're being indoctrinated online.
Well, yeah.
This
I
is
think adults-
huge. I've read testimonial after testimonial of particularly girls who go to YouTube and find these gender gurus who are going to guide them through this process of changing their bodies, of the hormones, of the surgeries, and all of that. And once they have made this commitment that, yes, I'm trans, or I'm this or that, they are welcomed into this online group of friends who give them that acceptance that they are longing for. And if they choose to someday change their mind and remove themselves from their group, they are belittled, they are ridiculed, they are put down, it's horrible.
It's a cult.
It is.
It almost sounds a little bit like a gang stuff too.
Yeah.
When they're brought in, they can't leave.
Getting to the previous comment about the suicides, we're talking about comorbidities here, which is a medical term for 2 or more disorders happening at the same time within a person. It is very common to have multiple comorbidities in someone with gender dysphoria. High rates of attempted suicide, an alarming 32 to 50% attempt suicide compared to 0.05% of the general population. And this doesn't change after they've had surgery, because some of them will come to a place where they realize they're still unhappy. It hasn't fixed the problem. Some will persist, as my ex-husband did. This is his book. I don't recommend that you read it. A lot of misquoted scripture and a lot of sadness. I cried multiple times reading the book. And for him, it didn't fix it. He's had many, many problems and issues along the way, and yet he still says, God made me this way for a reason. And he believes that one of those reasons that he believes God made him that way was so that he can minister to and encourage other transgender people. And he has continued to be in churches. He's been asked to leave churches that, have worked with him, and it's a very, very, very sad story.
I need all these words you have down there. I don't understand. I know what none of them are.
Okay.
Are they considered homosexuals?
No, that's
They're not considered-
that's
they're completely
completely different. And
These
this is-
people would not have been in Sodom and Gomorrah.
I don't know. I wasn't there.
So, I mean, that is a good point. Because there are some people who, okay, a woman transitions to become a man, but is still attracted to men. That person might consider themselves now homosexual. I know some guys who are in a relationship with a woman who is transitioned, so they consider that now homosexual. And then sometimes there's the man transitions to a woman, meets a woman who transitions to a man.
Oh my.
So,
But really?
so yeah, it's a little more complicated than just they are or they are not homosexual.
Most of the LGBT community, although they're quiet, they don't deny the biological sex. That's the big difference here, is, you know, you probably have friends that are gay, but they don't deny that they're male or female. So,
I was
Well,
thinking of a Christian.
I think,
most
I mean, unless it's somebody with gender dysphoria.
well, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying somebody who's truly
Okay,
same-sex attracted.
yes, okay.
I was
Yeah.
thinking of the biblical aspect of this as we're in church here.
Mm-hmm. We're getting there.
Apparently, God doesn't like that, as he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah.
Well, and I think this is, as Christians, this is where we have to go. We have to open our Bibles, and go ahead and open your Bibles or your Bible apps, and we've got to look at it.
And you flip the page over.
Basically, Genesis chapter 3. And some of these terms, I think I do want to mention affirmation therapy, which is, it's the current standard, it's the term and the current standard for medical and psychological treatments, which means we're not doing therapy. If you're a psychologist or a mental health therapist, and someone comes to you and says, "I'm transgender," or what, one of the other pluses, I need help. I'm really going through some turmoil in my life. In some places, this therapist can lose their license if they don't practice affirmation therapy, which is the patient knows best who they are, what they are, and we need to help them deal with their societal role, and we need to help them become comfortable in their choice. And many psychologists are not happy about that. There's one from Canada who has a podcast. His name is Dr. Jordan Peterson. If you're interested, you might listen to him. Another really good book, by the way, if you want to do further research, is written by Ryan Anderson, and it's called When Harry Became Sally. This is an excellent book. He gets into a lot of policies, how we determine policies in our country, responding to the transgender moment. It's an excellent book. I was able to hear him speak and meet him a couple years ago at a Christian Worldview conference. Okay, and then also I want you to you might want to write this down. Transformed, T-R-A-N-Z, Transformed. It's the title of a documentary. You can find it on YouTube. And it is from a biblical perspective, a psychological perspective, and there are 13 or 14 trans people who have detransitioned, and they give their testimonies, and it is powerful. You will hear things that you never thought could ever even happen to a person. Many of these people have been abused, neglected, put through some horrific things in their childhood. And so I encourage you to look that one up. It's very engaging, and you may want to watch it twice, as I did. Okay, the science. We hear that, well, there's this, this scientific study proves that it's genetic, blah, 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 blah. There is a brain that can be wired this way. And yet, when you dig into that study, it doesn't prove anything. it was a study of 11 people as opposed to a sample group of like 1,000 people. It's statistically not valid, and yet people will take that statement at the top of the abstract that says, this may mean such and such. It doesn't say, this means such and such. It may mean further research needs to be done, on this. But we don't hear that part of it in the media. So be very careful when you hear these studies coming out. Is it valid? Is it something? Yeah. Are we running out of time? I have no idea what time it is because I left my phone over there.
We are running out of time, but with the interest here and the fact, seeing all the scriptures here, I know what it's like when it's like, okay, I gotta get through like 10 scriptures in 10 minutes. I just want to put out, do we want to extend this from 1 to 2 sessions?
Yes.
I agree.
Yeah, we didn't get no scripture in, so yeah.
Are you available next week is really the question, or do we need
Am I available next week? I don't know.
Yes.
I think I am.
Unless you're playing or singing, I don't know.
I am not. I am not scheduled.
Then
I would
you're
be
busy.
happy to do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I appreciate the attitude and the concern that has been expressed this morning and the desire to learn about this.
All right, so with that, we still got like 10 minutes or so. So we're not like pack it up and leave. But I want to encourage you, as we're gonna let her continue as much as possible, but maybe even read through some of the scriptures on your notes. If you didn't notice, it's on the back page of your notes. And then if you think of some questions, you can send them to me, or I don't know if you're, maybe after the recording.
Thank you. Thank you. I almost wrote my email address up there. But tell you what, go ahead and write mine up there, sam@greencastlecc.org. It's a business, not personal. So if you think of some questions, send them to me, and I can get them to Anita, and then we can make sure to include that in next week's conversation. Greencastle CC.
Correct. Okay.
I won't finish it out, but I'll get it started.
While you're writing that, earlier you mentioned how, with the percentages you put up there, and how it seems like in politics and everything, millions of people suffer with this. But if you take, I had to look it up and figure it, the US population over 18 times 0.007, this is kind of average, that's less than 15,000 people in the whole US that really deal with this. But you would think there's millions the way we hear about it and see it promoted.
And if you're adding in the young people who have, if we add all of those people in, it's a much higher number, but nowhere near what we've been led to think.
And there are some, and I've encountered someone who, so we're doing this meet and greet, everybody's going around, and this person, right off the bat, my name is, and I'm they, them.
Pronouns.
Yet, this person presented as a female, had a female name, nothing seemed to indicate that she was anything but female. She just preferred, so I didn't know if it was she was an ally to transgender, and so that was her way, or she just didn't consider herself stereotypical female and didn't want to be defined by that. But she wouldn't be included in that, right? She is just her pronouns was
Yeah,
was the thing for her.
I mean, we can't determine whether she would be included in that. It's what she feels she is on the inside
Right.
would determine that.
And there
According
and there
to,
and would there be some who would, I don't know if it's agender or that don't really feel like they're male or female or I'm forgetting intersex or basically like, okay, depending on the day, maybe today I feel more female, maybe tomorrow I feel more male, and just go back and forth.
yeah, I'm trying to remember what that term is.
Gender fluidity.
Yes,
Yeah,
gender
thank you.
fluid.
Anita, are we gonna talk about, the effect or the schools, you know, how these guys and our grandkids, what kind of choices do we have, you know?
That
Is
may
it-
be a third session.
I'm sorry.
in another time or in an evening where moms and dads could come. I don't know. I had that thought yesterday that
Well, we live in a small town, but it doesn't mean it's not coming.
Yeah,
Right.
but I mean, some of the practical things is if somebody comes to GCC
Absolutely.
and they need to use the restroom, and okay, my first goal is I want them to know Jesus, but I also have to weigh the concerns of the single mom who's taking their kids to the restroom in there, and she needs to know Jesus. And that's where ethics get us into competing issues, because ultimately what we want to get down to, how do we I don't have control over the United States government and what national policy is, but when I engage somebody, like when I'm at the Playhouse, okay, how do I love this person well? Truth in love without sacrificing truth, but also maintaining a spirit of love. Basically, if Jesus encountered somebody who is transitioning, how would he respond to them?
exactly. And that's where we're going next week. That's exactly, you put it in a nutshell, way better than I could. So that's your teaser for next week.
Anita, I don't know what all these scriptures are that you're going to be going through next week, but I've been sitting here thinking this entire hour that there's a difference between before I became a Christian and after I have accepted Jesus into my life. And as I think about that, I'm reminded of Paul's admonition and his writing about the fact that some of you were, and there's a whole list of things.
Yes.
Such were some of you, past tense. You know, I mean, Jesus makes the difference.
I think one thing culturally we're running into also is there's a person cannot change. You know, like if you did something when you were 20 years old and I'm 70 some years old right now, I'm guilty of it today just as I was guilty of it, 20 years ago. You see, there's no redemption for people, in our culture anymore, that a person can't change.
But there is in Christ.
But there is in Christ, but that's where I see our biggest at odds, like, it can be, I don't care, conservative, liberal, or whatever, but like, as soon as you say something, well, if they can find something that you did when you were 15, they're gonna use it to every possible thing, and that's one of the things that Christ has to offer. You're a new creation in Christ. It may take you longer to get there, but you are a new creation, and we can't forget that as a church, that you are new in Christ, and we have to, we can't tolerate, well, I remember them back when.
And also with that to make sure we separate, just as Ephesians 6, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. The individual person who is struggling with this, who is experiencing that internal angst of my body is not the way it should be, right? you know, we can't dismiss, we just say, oh, well, you're just making that up. No, it's leading people, they are taking their lives. It is a very serious thing. Yet that individual person is not the one making new, media decisions for, that individual person is not the one who's saying, okay, this large chain store is going to change their bathroom policy. So when we get sometimes caught up in culture wars, let's not take our frustration at what's going on in the national scale out on an individual.
Amen.
The individual needs to be loved and dealt with as an individual. Someone, whether they how they understand it or not, they're made in the image of God. We want to help them to come to realize that means you're, the body that He's given you is good, all right? But yeah, we definitely need to separate that because I get the frustration when people far away from us are making decisions and it's like, oh, you're not thinking through the policies of that. Okay, but this person here, this teenager, this 20-year-old, they're not responsible for that either.
Yeah, that's so important for us to remember the absolute pain and distress that many of these people have felt their whole lives. Many hid it from their parents, hid it from everybody they knew. And then we have this coming out. They still have pain. And I think, bottom line as Christians, as Sam said, what they need most is the same thing as what we need most, and that is Jesus. We're all sinners. I'm getting into next week, but we'll talk more about that. And if you would, read through some of those scriptures, and I think we'll have a great discussion next week. So thanks,
Yes.
everybody.
Thank you, Anita.
Thank you, Anita.